He never spoke of the dreams until it was too late. In the winter of 1837, the boy known only as Thomas lived in a one-room cabin near the banks of the Gasconade River, in a sparsely settled corner of Franklin County, Missouri. He was 10 years old and small for his age, with pale hair that clung to his head like wet wheat and eyes that did not quite meet yours when spoken to. The locals called him quiet, touched maybe, though his mother, Abigail Lorne, insisted he was simply shy. But that year, something began to change, and by spring, even those who had once pitied the boy began to cross themselves when he walked past. Here's what they couldn't explain. Thomas began describing, in broken whispers, things that hadn't yet happened. He would speak of places no child should know, of faces twisted in fear, of details only someone present at the scene could possibly recount. And then, days later, the crimes would unfold exactly as he described them, sometimes within miles, sometimes states away. A girl strangled behind a church in Boone County, a trapper found gutted in his cabin near Osage, a family of 4 slaughtered outside of St. Charles, their blood soaking the prayer rug just as Thomas had drawn in the dirt behind the schoolhouse. He did not speak with drama or excitement. He didn't seem proud or frightened. The words came like a sickness, pulled from his lungs in the early hours before dawn. Abigail said it began on the first frost of November, after a night when he woke screaming in a voice that was not his own. That morning, his pillow was soaked through with sweat, and he wouldn't stop repeating, "The man with the crooked teeth, the baby cried first, then the silence." A week later, news reached town of the LeClaire baby found murdered in Phelps County. The father's jaw had been shattered, the teeth knocked sideways. The baby had been killed before the mother, who was discovered bound, throat severed, still holding the infant in her arms. No one knew how Thomas could have known. He had never left Franklin County. Midway through December, the school teacher refused to let the boy return. He'd carved something into the underside of the desk with a broken nail. A diagram, the teacher said, of bodies hung upside down. And that same week, a traveling merchant reported seeing a man hanging from a tree, skinned and dripping like meat, 30 miles downriver. When the sheriff rode out, he found not 1, but 3 bodies, slaughtered precisely as the boy had sketched. There is a line in the sheriff's logbook dated January 9th, 1838. The child sees death before it comes, or perhaps it follows him. That line was later struck out, but the ink bled through the page. The town preacher, Reverend Josiah Kane, took a special interest. He visited Abigail's cabin under the guise of offering spiritual counsel, but others noted how he lingered, how he began keeping a journal of the boy's nocturnal mutterings. The Reverend's own daughter, a sickly girl of 7, began having fits after playing near the Lorne cabin. She died 3 weeks later, eyes wide open, mouth contorted into what the coroner described as an expression of silent screaming. And still Thomas kept dreaming. One night he told his mother, "It's coming here. I saw the river open. I saw you." Abigail, exhausted and frightened beyond reason, beat the child with a wooden spoon until he stopped speaking. He never cried out. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "I don't want to see anymore." But the dreams didn't stop. They grew stronger, more detailed. He described names, dates, weather patterns, colors of dresses, and the direction of blood splatter. He would wake with scratches on his arms, dirt beneath his nails, sometimes sobbing, sometimes humming hymns he'd never been taught. Then came the morning when Abigail found him in the woods behind the cabin, staring at a patch of earth. He looked up at her and said, "That's where they'll find her." She asked who. He said only, "You'll know her by her braid." 3 days later, a search party found the school teacher's niece buried beneath that very patch, and in her hair, twisted with dry blood, was a long red braid. What Abigail did next would change everything. On the morning of February 3rd, 1838, with frost clinging to the window panes and the river sealed beneath a glaze of ice, Abigail Lorne took her son by the hand and walked him 10 miles through the woods to the chapel of St. Bartolomew's Hollow. It was an abandoned stone building, long out of use since the traveling priest who built it vanished some 15 years prior. No services had been held there since, but the place still bore a weight, a thick silence that muffled even the sound of birds. Abigail had heard the stories, like everyone else, about the church that never burned, even after 3 attempts by local men with torches and kerosene. They said the stones wouldn't catch, wouldn't blacken, wouldn't heat. Something in the walls was wrong. She didn't go there seeking salvation. She went seeking silence. She brought Thomas to the altar, wrapped in his threadbare coat, and laid him atop the cold stone table where communion had once been served. He said nothing. He didn't move. Abigail placed her hand on his forehead and prayed, not to God, but to whatever might be listening. "Take the visions," she whispered. "Take them from him, or take him from me." No one knows how long she stayed. When she emerged, her hair was dusted with snow and her boots soaked through with mud and blood. She returned home alone. Thomas remained inside the church. 3 days passed. No one saw Abigail leave her cabin. Smoke rose from her chimney, but there were no footsteps in the snow beyond her porch. Then, on the 4th morning, a deputy named Luther Coyle arrived, responding to a report of a missing child. He found the front door ajar and the fire long dead. In the center of the room, Abigail lay face down, her head resting on the Bible that had once belonged to her late husband. She was not breathing. Her skin was the color of stone. Pinned to her sleeve was a note written in Thomas's handwriting, crude and slanted. I tried to stop seeing. I closed my eyes. I covered my ears. I whispered the wrong names, but the dreams don't need my permission. Coyle later claimed the ink was still wet when he touched it. The sheriff organized a search party to investigate the chapel, fearing the worst. When they pried open the iron-bound doors of St. Bartolomew's, they found Thomas standing in the nave, barefoot, untouched by the cold. Around him, 37 dead birds lay in a perfect circle. Sparrows, crows, a single hawk, all of them with necks twisted at the same angle. Thomas looked up at the men and said, "I stopped dreaming." But the way he said it unsettled even the bravest among them. It wasn't a boy's voice. It was calm, old, and oddly resigned. They brought him back, and for a time, things seemed still. Thomas was taken in by a local widow, Esther Maples, who had no children of her own. She gave him food, bathed him, tried to speak gently to him. He didn't resist. He slept long hours and woke without screaming. The bruises that had once peppered his arms faded. For the first time in over a year, the town of Bay Hollow exhaled. But something had shifted. On March 1st, the sheriff's horse was found dismembered in its stall. No signs of struggle, no blood trail, just the animal's limbs placed neatly around a circle of salt. 3 days later, the preacher Josiah Kane was discovered in the river, face down, mouth filled with sewing needles. The coroner noted that his hands had been clasped in prayer. Thomas said nothing of either event, but Esther Maples woke on the night of March 7th to find the boy standing at the foot of her bed, eyes wide open, not blinking. He whispered, "They're not dreams anymore." She tried to touch him. He recoiled, and in that moment, she saw something that would haunt her to the end of her days. Thomas's pupils had vanished. His eyes were full white, and when he opened his mouth again, he spoke not in English, but in some language Esther would later describe as drenched in drowning. She never stayed another night in that house, but she told one man before she left, the town doctor, Henry Roake. And what Dr. Roake would do next would expose a truth even darker than the dreams themselves. Dr. Henry Roake was not a superstitious man. Born in Philadelphia to a family of Unitarians and educated at Columbia under the strictest rationalist tradition, he considered mysticism a vestige of medieval ignorance. He had come to Missouri to escape the politics of Eastern medicine, hoping to build a quieter life among the hills and rivers of a simpler land. But what he found in Bay Hollow was neither quiet nor simple. By the time Esther Maples appeared on his porch, eyes rimmed in sleepless purple, whispering of a boy with white eyes and a voice like a wet grave, Roake had already treated 2 cases that defied explanation: the preacher with the needles and the mutilated horse that had not bled. He did not believe Esther. Not at first, but the way she shook, the rawness in her voice, reminded him of patients from the war, the shell-shocked and the shattered. Something had terrified her beyond sanity, and when she placed her trembling hand on his wrist and said, "It isn't what the boy sees, doctor. It's what sees through him," he decided to go see Thomas for himself. The house was still. Esther had left food and water before fleeing, but the fire had burned out and frost clung to the glass. Thomas sat in a chair by the hearth, eyes closed, head bowed, breathing slow and even. He looked asleep. Dr. Roake approached with care, kneeling beside the boy. He reached out to check his pulse, but the moment his fingers touched Thomas's wrist, the child's eyes snapped open. They were no longer white, they were black. Not dark, but black, absorbing light, reflecting nothing. "You want to measure me?" the boy said, voice flat. "You want proof?" Dr. Roake recoiled, stumbled backward, and knocked over the basin beside the stove. The boy did not move. His gaze followed the doctor, and he continued, "There is no name for what lives in me now, but it remembers yours." That night, Roake returned to his study and began his notes. He called them the Lorne anomaly. He logged physical details, behavior patterns, even weather changes surrounding the boy's episodes. He included transcripts of things Thomas said in languages Roake could not identify. He sent letters to colleagues in St. Louis and New Orleans, inquiring about possession, hysteria, and dissociative trances. Most responded with polite skepticism, a few with concern for his own health. Only one wrote back with genuine interest: Dr. Elias Trumbull, an antiquarian physician known for his work on obscure neurological disorders. Trumbull's reply was brief. He asked only one question: "Has the boy begun drawing spirals?" Roake reread the letter 10 times, unsure why it chilled him. That same evening, he returned to the Maples house and searched the boy's room. Beneath the straw mattress, in the space where floorboards warped against damp, he found a dozen torn pages from the town's hymnals. Every page was covered front and back with spirals, some tight, others wide and broken, drawn in what appeared to be ash mixed with blood. Roake burned the pages. He told no one. But the boy knew. The following morning, Roake found a note on his own front door, nailed with a rusted spike. It read, "You saw the first circle. There are 13. That same week, the town's mill caught fire under strange circumstances. No thunder, no lightning, just a howl heard by neighbors, and then flames pouring from the roof. No one had entered or exited in hours. The miller, a widower named Clay Dobbins, was found inside, untouched by flame but dead nonetheless. His mouth was packed with black feathers. His fingernails had been removed. Roake's investigations grew frantic. He charted the events around Thomas in concentric rings. He began to see a pattern, a widening radius of death spreading out from wherever the boy had stayed. The further the event from the boy, the less violent, but the closer, more intimate, more deliberate, almost curated. Roake wrote again to Trumbull, pleading for help, but the letter came back unopened, a red X drawn across the seal. No forwarding address. On April 12th, Roake made his decision. He would take Thomas away from Bay Hollow, away from the town, away from anyone he might hurt. But Thomas was already waiting for him in the carriage. "You're too late, Doctor," he said. And then he smiled, a smile that did not belong to any child born of man. Dr. Roake felt the temperature shift before he registered anything else. The air in the carriage thickened, not with heat, but with an impossible stillness, as if the world itself had paused to witness something it had no language for. Thomas sat perfectly straight, his hands folded in his lap, but his face had altered. Subtly, not in expression, but in structure. His cheekbones seemed too sharp, his skin too smooth, as though it had forgotten how to contain blood. And behind his eyes, where childhood ought to dwell, there was something vast, something waiting. Roake did not speak. Instead, he climbed into the driver's seat and urged the horses forward. He had prepared for this. 2 satchels, one filled with sedatives and tools, the other with rations and maps, lay beneath the seat. His plan was simple. He would head east toward the unincorporated woodlands along the Gasconade border. He knew of an abandoned gamekeeper's cabin there, secluded and well hidden, a place with no neighbors, no paths. If Thomas was a danger to others, then isolation was the only mercy left. The boy didn't protest. Not once during the 2-day journey did he ask where they were going. He stared out the window, silent, occasionally humming low tones that made the horses uneasy. Roake slept in shifts, never closing his eyes for long. On the second night, he caught Thomas standing over the fire pit, hands outstretched as if in benediction. The flames rose, not just upward, but outward, crawling sideways into the frozen grass before dying suddenly, as if scalded. They arrived at the cabin on the 3rd morning. Roake secured the doors, barred the windows, and removed anything that could be used as a weapon. He kept Thomas inside, under constant observation, logging every hour in his journals. Days passed, then a week, and then something began to happen. Thomas started drawing again. He used coal from the fire, sticks dipped in animal fat, even his own blood when other mediums failed. The cabin walls became a tapestry of symbols, spirals, glyphs, names in lost alphabets. In one corner, he wrote a sentence in perfect Greek. "He comes when no one believes." Roake, who had studied classical languages at university, recognized the phrasing immediately, but it wasn't the grammar that troubled him. It was the tense, not past, not future, ongoing. That same night, Roake had the first dream. He stood in a corridor made of flesh, pulsing, breathing walls that narrowed with every step. Behind him, he heard whispers, not words, but the suggestion of voices, memories speaking in their sleep. At the end of the corridor was a door. On it, carved crudely, was a spiral. He reached for the handle, and then he woke, heart pounding, soaked in sweat. Thomas was standing over him, watching. "You heard it," the boy said, not asking. Roake nodded, barely. "It's not just mine anymore," Thomas whispered. "Now it's ours." That morning, the animals began to arrive. First a deer, starved, limping, its eyes milked with cataracts. Then 3 foxes, each missing their tails. They stood at the tree line, unmoving, staring toward the cabin. On the 5th day, crows came, hundreds of them lining the roof, the trees, the fence posts, so silent it made the world seem deaf. Roake grew desperate. He wrote to a Jesuit contact in St. Louis, pleading for an exorcist, but no one came. His final letter, dated May 3rd, was never sent. In it, he wrote, "It does not want release. It wants to be understood." He made his choice the next morning. He boiled water in the iron pot. He sterilized the needle. He prepared a tincture of laudanum, foxglove, and crushed belladonna, enough to stop a heart, maybe enough to stop a curse. But when he turned to administer it, Thomas was already lying on the cot, eyes closed, mouth open slightly as though he had been waiting. Roake hesitated only once, long enough to hear the boy whisper, "I forgive you, Henry." And then Roake injected the mixture into the boy's arm. The silence that followed was not natural, because when Thomas's body went still, something in the cabin began to breathe. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. Not the ordinary inhale and exhale of lungs, nor the shifting of old wood in cold wind. It was deeper, slower, as if the very structure of the cabin had taken on rhythm, boards creaking in perfect intervals, stones in the hearth exhaling warmth where no fire burned. Dr. Roake stepped back from the cot, the needle still trembling in his hand, and looked at the boy. Thomas lay motionless, eyes closed, no sign of life, but the air pulsed, and with each pulse, the symbols on the walls darkened, charcoal deepening into something wet, almost alive. Roake stumbled backward, heart pounding. He waited for the boy to gasp, twitch, show some response to the poison. None came. After 7 minutes, he reached to check for a pulse. There was none. Thomas Lorne was dead, but the drawings were not. The spirals began to shift, not physically. They did not smear or crawl, but in meaning. Roake could feel it, as if the intention behind them had been reversed. They no longer contained a warning. They were invitations. He grabbed a sack, began tearing down the parchment nailed to the walls, stuffing symbols into the fire. But the flames wouldn't catch. The pages blackened, curled, but no smoke rose. When he lifted one sheet, he saw something scrawled on the wood beneath it. It wasn't written in coal or ink. It was carved into the grain with a fingernail, and it read, "I see through the cracks now." That's when Roake heard the whisper. Not from Thomas, from under the floorboards. He dropped the parchment and backed away. The boards beneath the cot flexed slightly, then again, like something shifting beneath a layer of skin. For a moment, Roake considered running, but where would he go? The trees were lined with silent birds. The road had not held footprints in days. No one knew he was here. No one would come. Then Thomas opened his eyes. Roake froze. There was no transition, no gasp of resurrection, just movement, simple, smooth, as if waking from a nap. The boy sat up, turned to face him. His eyes were no longer black. They were mirrors, not silver, but reflective. Roake saw his own stunned face within them, stretched and warped. "You shouldn't have stopped it," Thomas said. Roake stepped back again. "I gave you enough to kill a man." "You did," the boy replied, smiling faintly. "But I'm not a man anymore." The wind howled outside. It hadn't howled before. The crows took flight in unison, shrieking as they vanished beyond the ridge, and then the silence returned, deeper than before, like a weight hung from the rafters. Roake reached for his satchel, but the boy stood. "I want to show you something," Thomas said. Roake didn't follow willingly, but his legs moved. Each step felt like walking into a deeper well of sleep. Thomas led him outside, barefoot through the frost. They passed the dead animals, now lying in a perfect spiral formation, heads turned inward, limbs folded. They walked to the edge of the woods, where the trees bent unnaturally, as if bowed toward something unseen, and there, in the clearing, was the first circle. Not a symbol, not a drawing, a pit, 6 feet wide, perfectly round, dug into the frozen earth, the edges smooth as if turned by a machine. No shovel marks, no debris. Inside it, nothing. Just black, not shadow, not depth, but blackness so absolute it seemed to eat the light from the sky. "This is where it speaks," Thomas said. "Where it told me the names, where it gave me the dreams." Roake tried to speak, but his throat closed. "I thought it wanted death," the boy continued. "But that was just the door. What it really wants is memory." He turned to face Roake, voice calm. "And you're going to help me carry it." The doctor turned, stumbled back toward the cabin, heart in chaos. But when he reached the porch, he saw something that made his knees give out. His journals, every one, were lined in a row, open, pages fluttering in the wind. Each page read the same thing. "You've already written this." That was the moment Dr. Roake realized the first twist in this story wasn't the boy. It was him. He fell to his knees, staring at the fluttering journals like a man looking into a cracked mirror. They were his. Every spine, every margin note in his precise, slanted hand. But the pages had changed, not just the words. The paper itself. Aged, yellowed. Some edges brittle, curled with mildew, as if they'd been buried for decades. He reached for the first volume, the one marked Feb. 1838 Bay Hollow Log. He turned to the inside cover, heart thudding. There, written in brown ink, was his own name. But the date wasn't February. It was October. October 7th, 1813, 25 years too early. He stood abruptly, dizzy. This couldn't be right. This couldn't be possible. But the wind whispered around the porch, and Thomas's voice rose behind him. "It's never just about time, Doctor. It's about arrangement. You thought the dreams were moving forward, but some things only make sense in reverse." Roake turned. The boy stood at the edge of the clearing, backlit by a sky now too dim for noon. Shadows stretched in impossible directions, bending not with the sun but toward the pit. Always toward the pit. Roake stepped back inside the cabin, seeking proof. Anything tactile, anything real. But the interior had changed. Gone were his tools, his satchels, his blankets. The hearth was now a hollow cavity, scorched black with soot that had never been there before. The windows had wooden slats nailed across them, not the way he'd left them. Old nails, rusted, covered in the dust of time. He rushed to the cot. It was empty. The corner where Thomas had laid for days was now a pile of wood splinters and straw. A rat's nest sat atop the moldy remains of what might once have been cloth. His pulse raced. He was no longer in the present or the past. He was nowhere. And the only constant was the boy. Thomas stepped through the door as if it were never closed. "You've been here before," he said softly. "Many times." Roake shook his head. "I remember every year of my life. Every patient, every mistake. This place, this moment. It's new to me." "No," Thomas whispered. "You just haven't died the right way yet." The boy's body was beginning to shift again. Taller now, leaner, the face no longer purely childlike, but a mirror of something Roake couldn't name. A face he might have once glimpsed in a fever dream or carved onto the tombstones of nightmares. There was something in his voice now, too. An echo behind the words, a second tone layered beneath the first. "I was never the beginning," the boy said. "You were." Roake took a step back. "That's not possible." But the second journal said otherwise. On the inside cover, beneath his name, was a sentence he could not recall writing. "I found him once before in a place with no stars." He dropped the book. "You carried it," Thomas said. "From the first spiral to the last. Each time you tried to bury it, it returned. Each time you poisoned me, you forgot. And each time, you wrote it down again." Roake stumbled outside, clutching his coat, breath fogging in the air. The pit still waited. It had not widened. It did not need to. What lay inside had no width, no depth, only hunger. He knelt beside it, and for the first time, he listened. The sound was not a voice. It was all voices, layered, indistinct, murmuring memories he had not lived but somehow recognized. A woman crying for her son, a man praying in a forgotten dialect, a scream that lasted too long to be human, and one phrase repeated over and over in the chorus, "The doctor forgets, the boy remembers." Thomas approached. No footsteps, no weight. "You can stop the spiral," he said, "but you'll need to go deeper." Roake's lips trembled. "How far?" The boy's eyes flickered. No longer silver, no longer black, now just lightless, not empty, but full of everything unseen. "All the way through," he whispered, "until you see what's been using you." Roake looked one last time at the journals scattered across the porch. The wind flipped another page. It was his handwriting, and the next line read, "Part 7 begins in the dark," and it did. Roake descended into the pit, not with a rope, not by ladder. There were no handholds, no steps, just a slope that should not have existed, carved into the earth with perfect geometry, spiraling down like the chambers of a shell. The light vanished almost immediately, swallowed by a blackness that did not blind. It consumed. The deeper he went, the less he felt the cold. Not warmth, not heat, just absence, like drifting into a place beyond sensation. The walls, though invisible, pulsed faintly. Not light, but rhythm, a heartbeat that wasn't his. He didn't question how he could breathe. He didn't question how his feet found purchase on nothing. He only remembered Thomas's final words, "Until you see what's been using you." The spiral tightened. Minutes passed, or hours, or lifetimes. Time here had no angle. Eventually, he saw the first face. It wasn't flesh. It wasn't even form. It was a contour in the black, outlined only by the slight change in vibration as he passed it. A human face, but not living. No eyes, no skin, no features carved by time or blood. Just suggestion, an echo of someone who had once been a man, and beneath it, scribbled in the dark like chalk drawn with bone, "Trumbull." The next came quickly after. A woman's shape, seated, head bowed as if in prayer. Her dress shimmered faintly in non-light, stitched with glyphs that matched the ones Thomas had drawn. Beneath her feet, Esther Maples. Roake stopped. It wasn't just that he knew these names. It was that he had written them in the journals, in the margins, as side notes, footnotes, speculative references, names of those he had interviewed, recorded, transcribed, dismissed. But they were here, archived into the spiral like pages in a book. He pressed onward. He passed the preacher, Cain, the widow, Abigail, even Clay Dobbins, the miller with the feathers in his throat. Each one marked, each one stored. The spiral tightened again. Now the figures pressed closer, their outlines brushing his shoulders, whispering in silence. He moved faster. Not from fear, from need. He had to know, had to reach the end, and then he saw himself. Not a reflection, an effigy, a man-shaped echo of Roake, seated on a chair made of journal pages, his coat stitched from timelines, his skin layered with spirals that pulsed faintly when Roake stepped closer. This Roake did not move, but he was not dead. The face twitched, the lips parted, and in his own voice, the echo said, "You asked what used you." Behind the effigy, the spiral opened one final time. Not downward, outward, a vast black corridor, ribbed like a windpipe, filled with shapes too large to see all at once. Things that moved without moving, things that breathed memories instead of air. And in the center, suspended like a cocoon of ink, was Thomas. Only not Thomas, a shape that wore the memory of the boy like a costume. It turned its head, and in Thomas's voice it said, "I didn't dream the murders. I remembered them." Roake tried to speak. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged. He stepped forward. The creature continued, "You thought I was a prophet. I was a vault. You opened me." It unfolded its arms, limbs that bent incorrectly, fingers that multiplied as they stretched, and gestured toward the walls. There were more names. Thousands, written in languages Roake had never studied but still somehow understood, because he'd written them too. "You are the spiral," the voice whispered. "You turn each time you try to end this. You chronicle us. Not to warn, not to stop, but to keep it alive." Roake staggered back, clutching his head. Memories flashed. Previous lives, previous spirals, faces of people he had watched die, places he had fled. pits he had descended, each time thinking he was solving something, but each time he was documenting it. He wasn't the doctor, he was the archivist. The story was the parasite. And the more he wrote, the more it fed. The boy moved forward, smiling with infinite patience. "You came to stop a child." His voice deepened, layered with thousands. "But you were always just here to write the next part." And as Roake fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the truth, the spiral began again. It wasn't metaphor. The spiral was not a concept or an allegory for madness. It was a structure, an organism, the shape of recurrence itself. Roake didn't fall into despair. He fell into pattern. He felt it winding beneath his skin, pulling at marrow and thought, rearranging the fibers of memory into something consumable. Every time he had written a line, every time he had observed a horror, every inked sentence in his journals had been a feeding, not a record, a ritual. Behind him, the shape that had once been Thomas remained suspended, arms extended as if blessing the spiral with his permanence. Around him, echoes of lives previously lived and forgotten pulsed against the membrane of this place. Roake heard them now, not as voices, but as intentions. Questions asked in 100 tongues. How do you end what repeats itself? Who first named the dream? What happens when the archivist refuses to write? He stood slowly, and when he did, the air shifted. Not in resistance, in acknowledgement. Somewhere far above, impossibly far, impossibly close, the wind moved in the trees of Missouri, and a crow turned its head sharply, sensing a shiver in the world's blueprint. Roake had a thought. One single thought. What if he did not write? What if he broke the spiral not by confronting the boy, or solving the mystery, or deciphering the glyphs, but by refusing to chronicle them? The moment he formed this thought, the spiral shuddered. A wave of silence erupted from the corridor, like the earth holding its breath. The echo of Thomas tilted its head, no longer smiling. "You can't unwrite what's written," the voice warned. Roake stepped back, eyes wide, defiant now. "But I can stop giving you more." And then he ran. Back up the corridor, back through the layers of memory. Faces blurred past him. Trumbull, Esther, Cain, Abigail, all folding inward like damp pages burned at the edge. The spiral shrieked, an actual sound this time, high-pitched, mournful, vibrating the marrow in his bones. But Roake did not stop, because for the first time he understood what the spiral feared. Abandonment, not resistance, just silence. To starve a parasite, you don't fight it, you leave it unfed. He climbed upward, breath burning, and the tunnel began to decay around him. Walls sloughed away like rotting paper. Names dissolved mid-air, symbols bled and unraveled. The spiral uncoiled, frantic to hold its shape. But Roake had already breached its edge, and then, light, not sun, not flame, but the soft grayness of early morning in a real world that did not whisper. He found himself lying at the mouth of the pit, the cabin in ruins, the forest silent, and Thomas, the boy, seated beside him, not suspended, not glowing, just a boy, muddy, barefoot, eyes tired. "You saw it," Thomas said quietly. Roake sat up, shaking. "Yes. And you came back." "I didn't finish it." Thomas looked out over the woods. "Maybe that's enough." They didn't speak for a long time. Crows returned to the trees, not screaming, just observing. A wind rustled the branches. Ordinary again. Time ticked. Breath steamed. Eventually, Roake stood. He left the journals. He didn't burn them. He didn't bury them. He simply walked away. Thomas didn't follow. Roake returned to Bay Hollow on foot. No one asked where he'd been. No one noticed how long he was gone. He resumed work at the infirmary, treated wounds, delivered 2 children. He began speaking less, smiled rarely, but when people looked into his eyes, they saw something closed, not broken, sealed, because the door hadn't been slammed shut. It had been quietly locked, and far beneath the woods, deep in the spiraled dark, something waited, starving. Because for the first time, the archivist was no longer writing. But hunger is patient. Hunger waits. And in the months that followed, Bay Hollow felt something tighten. Subtle at first, the river froze later than it ever had before, even though the air turned cold in mid-October. Crops bloomed too early, then too late. Bees swarmed, disoriented, vanishing into the trees and not returning. A schoolteacher developed a stutter overnight and never recovered. A pastor's wife began to dream in Latin, a language she had never learned. No one connected these things, not outwardly. But people began walking more quietly. Doors stayed locked longer. Sermons became shorter, with fewer mentions of the light. Something behind their eyes had dimmed. They wouldn't speak of the boy. They wouldn't speak of the doctor. But some watched the forest, and some listened, because the wind had begun whispering again, not words, but tone. A gentle, dragging sound like wet leaves pulled across teeth, and though Dr. Roake no longer kept journals, no longer scribbled notes in the margins of his hands, the weight of memory pressed against him like frost on window glass. Unseen, but felt, he tried to pretend. He smiled at mothers. He held infants gently. He stitched wounds with care. But he never entered the woods, and every week the birds circled his roof twice before flying on. It was Sheriff Coyle who came to him first, a man Roake had known for years. Coyle was slow-moving, methodical, raised on cattle and Calvinist guilt. His face was sun-worn, and his voice never rose above a cough. When he stepped into Roake's infirmary in the first week of November, he removed his hat, sat without speaking, and placed a bundle on the table between them. Roake opened it. Inside were feathers, not black, not gray, but red, deep, viscous red, and damp as though freshly plucked. Feathers from no bird Roake could identify. At the base of each one was a sliver of bone, sharpened and polished. "Found them nailed to the walls of the cane barn," Coyle said. 12 of them, circle formation. One missing. Roake stared at the feathers. Coyle added, "You stopped the boy." "I walked away," Roake answered. "That ain't the same." Roake didn't reply. Coyle leaned forward, resting thick fingers against the table's edge. "Something's building again, Henry. I seen it before. I seen the slope. And this is the wind-up." Roake didn't argue. He knew the rhythm too well. It wasn't a matter of belief. It was anatomy. The spiral was stretching its limbs, reorienting its shape through repetition. He'd cut the thread once, yes, but he'd done it by leaving, not by closing it, and now it was finding another path. That night, he returned to the cabin. It was exactly as he'd left it. Collapsed beams, mold-stained walls. The pit still yawned, untouched by time or season, surrounded by a ring of dead earth where nothing ever grew. Roake didn't go inside. He knelt beside it, placed his hand against the soil, and whispered, "I won't write it." The wind didn't answer, but something moved beneath the dirt. A shift, a breath, a knowing. Roake stood and left, but he wasn't alone, because the next morning a boy appeared on the steps of the infirmary. Not Thomas. Smaller, curled, wrapped in linen too fine for Bay Hollow. His skin was paper white, his hands too clean. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply stared at Roake with those same mirrored eyes, and in his hand, clutched tight, was a scrap of parchment. Roake pried it free. Written on it, in looping cursive that was unmistakably Roake's own, were 6 words. "You stopped it. It remembers you." The handwriting was aged, as though it had been written long before the boy was born. Roake folded the note, put it in his coat, and told the nurse to prepare a bed. Because he knew what this meant, the spiral had found its way back to him, and this time It wasn't offering memory, it was demanding legacy. The boy was given a room at the back of the infirmary. Roake told the townsfolk he was an orphan from the East, sent by a charity mission from St. Louis. No one asked questions. No one wanted to. Not anymore. The name on the boy's travel papers was Elias, though Roake hadn't submitted any such documentation nor seen any courier arrive. The nurse assumed the papers were arranged privately. Roake let her believe that. He let everyone believe a lot of things, but he knew the truth. The spiral had seeded itself again. Elias didn't speak for days. He did not cry. He didn't play. He merely sat by the window, watching the tree line. His eyes remained that same unsettling glass. Mirrored, bottomless. Every few hours he would tilt his head, as if listening to something no one else could hear, and each time he did, Roake felt a pulse in his chest. Not pain, not fear, but a sensation of being rewritten, like someone flipping through the pages of a book while it was still being written. On the fourth night, Roake entered the boys' room with a tray of food. Elias was drawing, not with pencils, but with ash. He'd crushed the burnt end of a firewood log and smeared it onto the wall. Spirals again, dozens, but not random. They were laid in a sequence, and at the center of them all, a single word in Greek, an amnesis, not a child's scribble. The letters were precise, ancient. Roake sat slowly beside him. "You remember things, don't you?" he asked gently. Elias nodded, but did not meet his gaze. Things that never happened. Elias looked up then and spoke for the first time. "They haven't happened yet, but they already hurt." Roake's hand trembled. Elias turned back to the window. "The spiral never leaves. It only chooses who will carry it next." Roake closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had seen this coming, every sign, every whisper. He just hadn't known how it would pass from host to host. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't even evil. It was a kind of record-keeping, a way for something larger to preserve its design, a parasite of stories, yes, but one that had learned how to wear human minds like gloves. Roake had escaped by refusing to feed it, but the spiral had found a new mouthpiece, and now it was shaping Elias to be its voice. He couldn't allow it. The next morning, Roake sent for Reverend Hardin, one of the few remaining ministers in the county who still performed exorcisms. The man arrived with salt, holy water, and 6 candles. Roake didn't believe in the ritual's power, but he believed in its structure, and structure was the spiral's weakness. Elias was seated on the infirmary cot, still drawing. Hardin began the prayers. Elias didn't flinch, but the air did. The light bent strangely across the walls. The candles sputtered without wind. The holy water hissed as it touched the floorboards. Then Elias spoke. "Wrong prayers," he said softly. Hardin ignored him. Elias tilted his head again. "You're asking a God that doesn't remember you." Then the lights went out. Not dimmed, not failed. They vanished. Total blackout, and in that silence, the Reverend began to choke, clutching at his throat, gasping, eyes wide with something that was not pain, but recognition. Roake rushed to his side, but it was too late. When the lights returned, Hardin was unconscious and scrawled across his chest in spirals of ash. "You offered structure. I gave it memory." That night, Elias vanished from his room. The bed was undisturbed. The window was closed. But the spiral had grown, drawn not in ash this time, but in blood, fresh, sharp. And as Roake stared at the wall, he realized something far worse than a return. The spiral had not just come back. It had learned, and this time, it wasn't content to whisper. It wanted to be heard. Bay Hollow heard it. Not through sound, but through disruption. The town's clocks began skipping seconds, then hours. Roosters crowed at dusk. The well at Claver's farm gave back salt instead of water. A newborn spoke a full sentence before taking its first breath. then never uttered a sound again. The schoolhouse bell rang by itself at night, always at 3:13 a.m., a time that hadn't yet appeared on the town's handmade watches. By the third week of November, 12 townspeople were dead, none of them by trauma, all had simply stopped being. Eyes open, breathing halted. No sign of disease or violence, each found with a spiral drawn somewhere nearby, on wallpaper, on their mirror, on the ceiling above their bed. And all 12 had one thing in common. They had spoken to Elias. Roake's mind frayed, but his focus sharpened. He stayed awake for days, reviewing everything he had ever written, everything he had burned. Patterns emerged not in the events, but in their gaps. The spiral didn't behave like a linear narrative. It thrived in the pauses, the skipped years, the forgotten journals, the wrong names remembered too vividly, and it fed on attention. The more it was observed, the more real it became. He had tried silence. He had tried escape. But both had only delayed the spiral's progress. Now it was adapting, manifesting through a boy it had chosen, not possessed. Elias wasn't a victim. He was an architect, a new archivist, designed not just to record, but to multiply, and something was building toward the 13th. 13 spirals, 13 names, 13 vessels. Elias was gone, but not hidden. Roake found the trail in the old cane barn where the red feathers had once hung. Now bone totems lined the rafters, strung with sinew and ash. In the loft, etched into the floor, was a perfect spiral, 6 feet wide, filled with tiny names scratched in concentric rings. Esther, Dobbins, Harden, Trumbull. And in the center, a blank space, unfilled, waiting. Roake knew what it meant. He was the 13th. But why hadn't it taken him yet? Why hadn't it consumed him when he was most vulnerable? Because the spiral didn't want submission. It wanted authorship. Roake was the final stroke in a design centuries old. His resistance was the final act. His choice, his refusal, was the last thing standing between the spiral and permanence. He left the barn and returned to his house. It was dusk. He didn't light a lamp. He took out the last blank journal he had hidden under the floorboards years ago. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he retrieved one final letter, one he had written long ago and never sent. It was addressed to Esther Maples. In it, he had described the first dream, the corridor of flesh, the door, the voice that asked, "Do you remember being written?" But the letter was unfinished. The ink had run, the words smeared by some forgotten flood. He stared at the last line. I saw my name on its tongue. Roake sat at his desk. He opened the journal. He held the pen. He did not write. He only waited. And the spiral responded. Wind shattered the windows. Books flew from shelves in arcs. The lights flickered, not with electricity, but with memory. Scenes from Roake's life projected across the walls like living silhouettes. His birth, his studies, the first time he heard Thomas speak in tongues, the moment he watched the fire refuse to burn. The room darkened. A voice whispered from the walls, "You will write." Roake stood. He placed the pen down and he spoke, not with anger, not with fear, but with finality. No. Then silence. The spiral recoiled. The air pulled inward as if gasping, and in the stillness that followed, Roake turned and walked out the front door, into the cold. He left the journal open, untouched. The pages fluttered in the wind. And on the final blank page, without ink, without hand, a new line appeared. If he will not write it, someone else will. Roake didn't sleep that night. He walked the perimeter of Bay Hollow in silence, following the edge of the tree line where the wind hissed low but constant, like a breath behind a locked door. The town had changed again, not in its shape, but in how it felt. The buildings no longer cast shadows in the direction the sun demanded. Footprints in the snow didn't match the feet that left them. The birds flew in circles, but never landed. A baby's cry echoed from an empty stable at midnight and never stopped. This wasn't haunting, it was rehearsal. The spiral wasn't just reappearing, it was preparing to stage itself permanently. The journal had been the first test, a blank page invaded without consent, a sentence that appeared without a writer. The spiral had learned to speak through omission, and now it was proving a darker truth. Authorship was never required. It didn't need Roake's hand anymore, only his resistance, only the tension, because all stories require friction, and the spiral thrived in struggle. Roake's thoughts returned to Elias. The boy was not a mouthpiece. He was a vessel, but not an unwilling one. Elias had spoken the spiral into presence, not because he was controlled, but because he believed. That belief gave the spiral something Roake had always denied it: faith. And now, someone else, perhaps Elias, perhaps another, was ready to write. The names were growing again. He saw it in chalk on the courthouse steps, in soot beneath the baker's awning. On the roof of the general store, visible only from the steeple, always spirals, always in 13s, but the center was still blank, still waiting. Roake returned to the infirmary the following morning. He sat in his office, surrounded by empty chairs and silent clocks. The nurse had not returned since the night of Elias's disappearance. The Reverend remained comatose, his breathing shallow, his dreams untranslatable. He took out one final object from his desk drawer. Not a journal, not a letter, a mirror. Small, circular, cracked. The same one Thomas had stared into all those years ago in the cabin just before the sedative. Roake looked into it now. His reflection was distorted, of course, but not by the crack, by something behind it. In the glass, he didn't see his face. He saw a boy, not Elias, not Thomas, another child, wide-eyed, mouth open, drawing a spiral in ash with a finger that bled freely from the tip. A spiral that never closed, that bled inward instead of out. And around the boy stood 12 others, 12 faceless outlines, each one holding a journal. Each journal had Roake's name stamped in gold on the spine. But none had been written by him. They were about him. Biographies composed by something watching, from inside the spiral. Roake closed the mirror and stood. He returned to the cabin. It took him 4 hours to reach the site, but the ground remembered him. The dead zone around the pit had widened. The trees leaned away, bark peeling in long strips as though flinching from something beneath. The pit was no longer empty. Inside stood Elias. Naked, eyes open, mouth closed. He didn't speak. He only pointed to the dirt beside him. Roake understood. This wasn't a place of death. It was a stage, and the final act had not yet been written, not because it wasn't known, but because the spiral wanted him to see it performed. Not read, not recorded, witnessed. He stepped into the pit. The earth did not resist him. It folded, cradled, and as Roake stood beside Elias, shoulder to shoulder in the spiral's mouth, he felt the weight of 13 voices settle across his bones, each whispering the same word. Remember, because remembering was how the spiral began, and remembering was how it would end, if it ever ended. Roake stood still, ankle deep in dirt that pulsed faintly beneath his feet, not with life, but with repetition. Elias remained motionless beside him, gaze fixed forward at something unseen. Around them, the pit's edges had changed, no longer a circle of soil, now a wall of memory, faces etched into earth, moving subtly, breathing with the rhythm of the spiral. The townspeople, the dead, the not yet born. Every face Roake had once seen flicker in a journal, each now pressed like fossils into the walls, watching. A 13th voice spoke, not aloud, but through Elias. You must choose. The boy's mouth never moved, but Roake heard it. He looked up, searching for sky, but the light above had bent, twisting into a slow swirl of colorless haze. The spiral didn't just live below ground. It had risen. It had taken shape in geometry, in chronology, in the very design of belief. The way humans remembered, the way they insisted on telling stories. The spiral was not a monster. It was a method. And now, Roake understood the true structure of it. Part 1 was birth. Part 2 was doubt. Part 3 was observation. Part 4 was resistance. And Part 13? Legacy. The voice in Elias spoke again. Choose the one who follows. Roake shook his head. No. The earth groaned. A crack split beside his feet. Narrow, deep, filled with whispers that sounded like scripture falling apart. Choose, the voice said again. No. Roake's voice was steady now. The spiral could coerce. It could trick. It could feed, but it couldn't force. That was the flaw, and the truth behind the faces in the wall. They were not victims. They were authors. Each had agreed. Each had taken the pen, thinking they were preserving something or preventing it, and in doing so, they'd sealed the next loop. Roake stepped forward. He knelt in the center of the spiral and drew a single symbol in the dirt. A line, just a line, unbroken. Straight, it cut across the spiral's curve like a blade. The earth hissed. The wall faces wept dust. Elias collapsed. The pit shuddered. Above them, the trees began to bend inward. Roake spoke aloud now, knowing the spiral would hear him. Not through airs, but through narrative. You aren't a god. You're a sentence without a period. And I will not finish you. A scream erupted from the ground, not from Elias, but from the spiral itself. A wail made not of voice, but of meaning. The spiral was unraveling, because for the first time in its long, recursive life, the story had refused its own ending. Roake pulled Elias to his feet. The boy was conscious again, confused, breathing hard. What is this? He asked. Roake looked down at the symbol he had drawn. It's a straight line. Elias blinked, but stories don't move in straight lines. Roake helped him from the pit. Exactly. The ground trembled but did not collapse. The walls cracked but held. The spiral was dying, not in fire, not in silence, but in incompletion, because stories don't survive when they're abandoned. As they walked from the clearing, a final sound echoed through the woods. Laughter. Not cruel, not triumphant, just confused. As if something ancient had finally lost its shape and didn't know what came next, and in its confusion, it wept, but no one wrote it down, and nothing remembered, or so Roake believed. They left the clearing in silence, the boy limping slightly, Roake supporting him with a trembling arm. Behind them, the pit remained open, but quiet. No wind, no voice, just a hollow in the earth where so many had knelt, cried, offered, recorded. And now, nothing, not even an echo. Bay Hollow did not notice their return. The town had become strangely still. No more deaths, no more spirals, no more red feathers or backward prayers. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, Roake stepped through the streets without glancing over his shoulder. He greeted those who passed him, and they greeted him back, not with dread, but with the dull gaze of people who had forgotten something, truly forgotten, not buried, erased. The spiral had lost its grip, not in battle, not in blood, but in refusal, in incompletion and without memory. It could not persist. Roake took Elias back to the infirmary. The drawings on the wall were gone, the bed unmade, the cracked mirror intact. He told the boy to rest. He made soup. He lit a candle. Normal things, human things, the kind of things that spiral logic had no use for. Elias slept that night for 12 hours, the first full sleep of his life. No twitching, no murmurs, no whispered dreams. Roake sat beside him, reading nothing, writing nothing, just watching. And yet, something shifted in the days that followed. The birds began returning to Bay Hollow, but they flew in strange, rigid lines. A tree on the outskirts bloomed out of season, every leaf shaped like a teardrop. The Reverend, still unconscious, began mouthing silent words. They were not in Latin. The sun cast 2 shadows at noon. And then the journal returned. Roake found it beneath his bed. Not one of his, not one he recognized. Its cover was made of something dry and taut. Not leather, not hide, something older. The pages were filled already, each one in a different hand, each one about him. They weren't copies, they were accounts, each written from a different place, a different year. Voices describing Roake before he was born, describing the spiral as if it had always known his shape. At the center of the journal was a page Roake could barely touch. It pulsed, it resisted, and written on it in dark ink was a single sentence. The spiral is not a story. Beneath it, a second line. It's the need for one. Roake sat at his desk, staring at that page for hours. He did not write, but he began to understand. They had not destroyed the spiral, they had simply denied it the present. But the past remained porous, alive, hungry. The spiral didn't need to move forward. It could wait, slip backward, thread itself through forgotten dreams, lost names, collapsed towns, unwritten books. As long as there were stories never told or memories misplaced, the spiral could seed itself again. Elias came to him the next morning. He held a note. It was not written in Roake's hand, but the signature at the bottom said, Roake. The message was short. You were never meant to end it, only to pause it. Elias said nothing. He left the note on the desk and walked outside toward the woods, toward the clearing where the pit had once spoken. Roake didn't follow. He stayed seated, the journal before him, the candle burning low. A third line had appeared on the pulsing page. The spiral needs silence, but only until someone listens again. He stared at it and wondered, had he truly silenced it, or had he simply become its most convincing witness? And if so, who was reading his story now? Because someone was. Someone always would be. The thought didn't frighten Roake anymore. It humbled him. Because at the end of everything, past the voices, past the pit, past the pages that wrote themselves, he finally understood that no story ever ends. They only leave the room, step behind the curtain, wait for silence to settle. And then they return. In new hands, on new tongues, wearing new names. The spiral had not died. It had only been paused, and Elias was its breath, held but not exhaled. For months, the town returned to something resembling normal, or at least something forgetful. The trees shed their leaves on time. The preacher's voice returned, though softer, as if cautious not to speak too much at once. No new spirals appeared, no animals fell in circles, and no more children dreamed in foreign tongues. Roake resumed work. He taught Elias to tend wounds, measure heartbeats, listen to lungs. He told him nothing of the spiral, not directly, but sometimes when Elias slept, he spoke back in his dreams, not in English, not in any language Roake could name, but the cadence, the rhythm, was too familiar. And the spiral, Roake realized, no longer needed to show itself to move. It only needed its listeners to believe they'd forgotten. One night, Elias placed a notebook on Roake's desk. It was hand-bound, stitched with twine. The pages were filled with drawings, careful, deliberate, haunting, not spirals. Lines, straight, intersecting, creating shapes Roake couldn't name. Angles that defied geometry, distances that bent into themselves. What are these? Roake asked. Elias didn't answer right away. Then, they're things I see when I try not to see the spiral. Roake traced one shape with his fingertip. And what do they want? Elias hesitated. "I think they want to unwrite it." Roake met his eyes. "Then let's help them." And that was when something began. Not a new spiral, not a loop, a fracture, a new pattern, not born of memory, but of interruption. They traveled together, from Bay Hollow to St. Louis, then east to New York. Elias became a quiet presence in the scientific circles Roake once feared. He spoke little, but observed much. Psychiatrists called him gifted, priests called him touched, poets called him dangerous, but Roake never called him anything but Elias. Together, they published no books, they founded no institutions, they rejected every offer to document their experiences. And when Roake finally passed, years later, his will was simple. No eulogies, no obituaries, no monument, only one request, that Elias return the journal to the earth where it began. And so, on a cold October night, Elias dug into the old clearing. The pit was gone. Covered now with moss, the dead zone healed. He buried the journal beneath a ring of salt and placed over it a stone with no name. Then he waited. He listened, but the ground did not whisper. The air did not bend. There was only wind and silence, and the line he had drawn in his notebook, unbroken. He walked away, and the spiral, for now, remained still. But in some forgotten room, behind a shuttered window, someone turned a page. Their hand paused. Their head tilted, and their eyes caught a shape that had no beginning and no end, just a curve, just a whisper, just a memory, waiting to be remembered again. And somewhere, far beneath the weight of time, 13 names stirred, 13 voices leaned forward. And one final question asked itself, quiet and eternal: who will write next?